A third person whose flaws I talk about in the book, I don't go into a lot of detail about all this, but it's important to recognize. A third person whose flaws I talk about is William Douglas, the Supreme Court Justice, who was one of the great civil libertarians of all time, whose writings on the Supreme Court changed America in many ways. But he was a miserable human being. He had 5 wives. He was miserable to his family, to his children. He was exploitive of his law clerks. He thought he should be president of the United States. He thought being on the Supreme Court wasn't good enough for him. He always thought he should have been president. He was not somebody I'd want to go on vacation with, let's put it that way, right? But he was a great public figure. Similarly, Earl Warren, right, was a conservative Republican governor of California who, as the Attorney General of California, was responsible for interning the Japanese during World War II in internment camps. You know, a gross violation of civil liberties. And yet when Eisenhower in 1953 appointed him to the Supreme Court, something happened. Something changed him. And he began to become much more of a civil libertarian, much more of a progressive and a liberal. And the Warren Court, under his leadership, not only passed the Brown versus Board of Education decision against school segregation, but all kinds of other great court decisions which have changed America for the better. There have been attempts to push it back in the other direction, as Maria said, but there are clearly things that Americans now take for granted, including if you watch the show Law and Order, right, a very conservative show, which always takes the side of the prosecutors over the defendants, right? You know, any of my 15-year-old twin daughters can tell you that when you get arrested, somebody has to say to you, you have a right to an attorney, right? That didn't exist until Earl Warren and the Warren Court, right? And so there are, you know, many aspects of American life that have improved because of Earl Warren. And one last example of this question of flaws or, you know, strategic mistakes. You know, I always admired Ralph Nader. I thought Ralph Nader, if Ralph Nader had retired in 1995, right, and you'd asked me who were the 5 greatest Americans of the 20th century, I may have put him in that list. His post-2000 political career and his arrogance in remaining on the ticket in 2000, which handed the election to George Bush. I mean, clearly Al Gore. Hey, I'm talking. So clearly Al Gore screwed up the campaign, but Ralph Nader certainly contributed to making it possible for George Bush to be elected president. But if you look back in the 20th century, workplace safety laws, OSHA, the EPA, the brownfields legislation, Superfund, seat belts. When you go on a plane and they tell you there's no room on the plane because they've overbooked, and they say you now can get free tickets to go somewhere else, Ralph Nader passed the law to do that. I mean, and there are so many ways in our daily life that Ralph Nader has improved the working and living and health conditions of our society. But he made this one strategic error for which I can never forgive him. And I've written some pretty nasty things about Ralph Nader over the last couple of years because he doesn't seem to have learned his lesson. But I don't want to put that. I want to put that aside because he belongs in the book. So finally, let me talk about Mike. Mike Harrington was probably the most influential person in my life, maybe beside my parents, in shaping my political views anyway. And it began when I was in high school, when he was becoming a celebrity. And he spoke at my synagogue in New Jersey. And The Other America had just come out, 1962, 50 years ago. And he was a public figure. He didn't want to be a public figure, but he inadvertently became a public figure because the book, which nobody thought was going to sell very well, took off. The moment was right in America for people to be talking about poverty. And so he wrote this book, which it's important to recognize is a tiny little book, right? It's less than, I mean, this wasn't, the original hardback was bigger than this, but it was only 200, it was less than 200 pages, right? And it was Mike Harrington's description of this invisible world in America, the third world inside America of poor people. And he gave us a kind of guided tour of this group of people who most Americans didn't know exist or didn't want to know existed, right? So remember what the time was, 1962, right? World War II had ended in 1946, and the next 16 years of American life were the period of most astounding economic growth of any society in the history of the world, right? Thanks to Walter Reuther and the labor movement in particular, the poor and the working class were able to be, most of them, be lifted into the middle class. And America was celebrating this prosperity and the growth of the middle class and thinking that this was the greatest society that ever lived. And Americans were now moving to the suburbs. More Americans were able to go to college. More Americans were able to buy a house. More Americans were able to have a car. Not only a car, but every 2 or 3 years a new car, right, which was called planned obsolescence, where the car industry wanted you to buy a new car, so they made sure that the cars fell apart every couple of years. The American dream of sending your kids to college was becoming truer and truer for more people. America was celebrating its prosperity and also comparing its prosperity to what they said was the alternative, which was communism, right? And so the Cold War was happening at the time, and Americans were told, this is the greatest country in the world, and nothing like this is happening in the Eastern Bloc of the Soviet Union and its satellites. And so we need to defend our way of life against the potential regimentation and authoritarianism of Soviet communism. And so the twin aspects of American life that were at the center of our culture were the Cold War and American prosperity and Americans becoming more middle class. And so America was celebrating its affluence. And in 1958, an economist at Harvard named John Kenneth Galbraith, who's one of the people in the book, wrote a book called The Affluent Society. Now, it was not a celebration of affluence. It was a statement that America has a lot of private wealth, but its public world, its streets, its sewers, its university system, and so forth, are not keeping up with the needs of a civilized society. And so he was arguing for, at a very early point, more environmental sustainability, more public works, a greater sense of the common good and not just private individual consumerism. So into this mix, you know, Americans are kind of ignoring the fact that there are still poor people in America. Galbraith, in his book, The Affluent Society, mentions the poor as kind of an afterthought. He says there are two kinds of poor people. There are people that are poor because they're mentally ill or they have some other physical or mental problems. And then he said there are people kind of stuck in areas like Appalachia, which are kind of behind the times. But Michael Harrington comes along, and in The Other America, he says that 1/4 of Americans are poor. 1/4 of Americans are poor in 1962, using, at the time, the census data, which was pretty rudimentary. And then he goes around to the country, and he talks about what it's like to be poor. He goes to a factory in Ohio that it just, or maybe in Chicago, just laid off its workers, and what it was like to be, you know, in the midst of this affluent society, to be laid off and not have another job. He went into the ghettos of New York and Chicago and some other cities and talked about what it was like to be poor and African American. He went to Appalachia. He talked to farm workers, and he described what it was like to be poor in a way that was not, he wasn't guilt-tripping Americans, he was describing, right? And Mike Harrington was a socialist. Mike Harrington was, at the time, he was like 33 years old, right? He graduated from Holy Cross College, a Catholic school in Worcester, Massachusetts. He grew up in St. Louis, went to Holy Cross. He wanted to be a writer, wanted to be a journalist, wanted to be a poet. Then he spends a year at the University of Chicago to get a master's in English. He drops out. Then under pressure from his parents, he goes to Yale Law School for a year. He drops out. And he's kind of at a loss to what to do. He moves to New York. He lives in Greenwich Village. And he wants to be a poet. And he wants to write novels. But to make but he gets involved with the Catholic worker, right? The movement, the social justice movement among Catholic radicals led by Dorothy Day, who's also in the book. And he lives in a Catholic worker house in the Bowery, the Skid Row of New York. And he gets exposed really for the first time to desperate poverty. This is in the 1950s. Right? And he starts writing for the Catholic worker newspaper. And he clearly has a facility for journalism and for description, a kind of novelist's ability to tell a good story. So he starts writing for other magazines, small magazines like Dissent, and which had been founded a couple years earlier, and the New Statesman, and the New Republic, and the Nation, right? And he writes movie reviews, he writes human interest stories, he writes film reviews, he writes about the anti-war movement against the Korean War and against nuclear testing. And he writes a couple articles about what it's like to be poor in the Bowery. And an editor at a publishing house calls him up one day and says, Mike, would you like to expand those articles into a book? And he says, no, not really. No, I'm not interested. He says, I'll give you a $500 advance. He says, okay, I'll do it. I'll write it. That's how the Other America happened, right? He got a $500 advance. Back then, in 1960, that was a lot of money for a struggling bohemian poet. And so he writes this book, right? And while he's doing this, he's becoming more political, and he eventually joins the Socialist Party, and he becomes a organizer, kind of like what you're doing, right? Going around the country, except he was doing it by hitchhiking, right? Going around the country and speaking to 5 students at Oberlin and 10 students at Swarthmore and 15 students at the University of Chicago, trying to recruit them into the socialist movement the way you just were doing, except here we're a little older, but trying to get the next generation of college students to join what was then YPSL, right, the Young People's Socialist League, the youth wing of the Socialist Party. And Mike is a great speaker, and he does attract some people to YPSL, but basically YPSL remains, and the Socialist Party remains, a tiny little organization with no more than a few thousand people. Right? So while he's writing this book about poverty, he's employed, he's a full-time socialist. Right? That's what he does for a living. He makes a very meager living, right? So that's why he needed the $500 to write the book. And he's going around the country talking about socialism. So one of the great ironies of this book is that the word socialism isn't here at all. Mike Harrington believed that this book had to appeal to the widest number of people. He wanted to appeal to the conscience of America. And so Mike Harrington decided he would leave out the word socialism, leave out the word capitalism. The word capitalism doesn't appear in the book either. And he talks about, the moral outrage of poverty in an affluent country. He has some prescriptions at the end of the book, which are basically radical prescriptions, including full employment at decent wages and stronger unions, things that we would all probably agree with. But he doesn't talk about socialism. And throughout his life, he always was on this tightrope. And many of the people in my book were like that as well. Always on this tightrope between working in the movements for progressive reform, right, civil rights, labor unions, women's rights, and so forth, and being a socialist. Right? And he never ever really resolved that. I mean, he, more than anyone else, I think, he was able to articulate what he was doing, and he called for radicals and socialists to do what he called the left wing of the possible. That was his phrase that really struck me, the left wing of the possible, right? That we can't be revolutionaries, we can't be utopians, we need to figure out what's possible under certain circumstances and push for that. And so, as I said earlier, he was very involved. He worked very closely with Martin Luther King. Along with Bayard Rustin, he wrote some of King's speeches. He did a lot of work in the civil rights movement. He was very close to Teddy Kennedy. He wrote some of Kennedy's speeches. He was very close to Walter Reuther. And he was quite critical of the mainstream of the Democratic Party. He was quite critical of some of the mainstream of the labor movement, but he wanted to work inside the system and outside the system at the same time. So there was really this tightrope. And socialists are always walking that tightrope. So I first came across Michael Harrington when he came to my temple when I was 14 or 15 years old, and he gave this speech about civil rights and about poverty in America. And I'd never heard of him before. I don't even know why he was invited, although my temple was fairly liberal. Our rabbi had been involved in the civil rights movement. And I was active in my temple youth group, and we used to do sort of charity work in the ghetto of my hometown, where we'd go into the inner city. We'd go to a settlement house on Saturday mornings, and we would do, we would work with kids and so forth. So we're doing kind of little social worky kinds of things. But he came to the temple. My parents wanted me to hear him, so they made sure I went to hear him. And he didn't say he was a socialist. He talked about poverty and race relations in America. And then I went back and I read the book. Right. And I didn't say anything about socialism either. But then I forget where I heard this, but at some point I heard, I think I was later in high school, maybe it wasn't until I was in college, I don't remember, I heard that Michael Harrington was a socialist. And I went, aha, then maybe I'm a socialist, right? Because I believe in everything he said. And I agreed with him. And so I later joined DSA. Before that it was called DSOC, Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. And I got to know Mike. I was on, in the 80s, I was on the executive committee of DSA for a couple of years. And I was always impressed, that's not even a strong enough word, I was always astounded at his stamina. He could give, he could give stem winding hour-and-a-half speeches and then spend all night in a bar talking about stuff with college students. And then he could go teach classes at Queens College, which he did because he needed the health insurance, so they hired him to teach there. Then he could go to Europe and represent the Socialist International, the American Socialist Movement. And where if he lived in Europe, he probably would have been like a prime minister or a member of the cabinet. But here in the United States, he was a marginal figure, right? And so Mike Harrington was, the kind of person who in other countries would be well known because they admired their radical socialist intellectuals. But it was only for a couple of years that Mike was well known. After the book came out, the head of the anti-poverty program under Lyndon Johnson, Sergeant Shriver, who was part of the Kennedy family, invited Mike to come to Washington and help them formulate the anti-poverty program. And Mike said, well, what we need is another WPA program, another jobs program, a full employment program. And Shriver said, we don't have enough money for that. And Michael Harrington said, you can't fight poverty with nickels and dimes. And Shriver said to him, I don't know about you, Mr. Harrington, but I've never spent $1 billion before, right? Which seemed like a lot of money. It actually wasn't. It was about 1% of the federal budget for the anti-poverty programs. And so he got very frustrated with the Johnson administration's poverty program, but he supported it anyway because that was part of his left wing of the possible idea, right? And so for a couple of years, Mike was on the speaking circuit. He spoke at colleges and labor unions and churches and synagogues, and he was on television, and William Buckley invited him onto his TV show quite often, the conservative writer. And Mike he had a newspaper column. He was on the radio quite a bit at the beginning of NPR. And then beginning in probably the mid-70s or 80s, Mike became kind of a marginal figure. And if you ask most Americans under 60, and probably even most Americans over 60, they don't know who Michael Harrington is. There's no schools named after him. There's no roads named after him. There's no Michael Harrington Museum. There's no public statement of Mike's existence, except those of us who remember him and try to keep his legacy alive. And so this is the 50th anniversary of this book coming out. And this year there have been a number of celebrations of Mike's work. The last issue of the American Prospect was devoted to Mike. It was about poverty. I was at Holy Cross about 3 months ago at a conference about Mike. Holy Cross, who had sort of forgotten that Mike was a graduate of the school, finally remembered and did a wonderful 2-day conference about Mike. There was another conference in Washington, D.C. about a month ago, co-sponsored by the American Prospect and Demos, a progressive think tank. So Mike is sort of getting a kind of another wind beneath his wings. He died in 1986. So I want to tell you one more story about Mike, and then I'll end. In 1985, I think, Mike was diagnosed with cancer. And it was the worst kind of cancer. It was cancer of the throat for somebody who was a spellbinding public speaker, who made his living speaking for a living and teaching. That was quite gruesome. And he knew he didn't have very long to live. But he kept speaking. He kept talking. He kept going on lectures. And so I was living in Boston. I was working for the mayor of Boston at the time. His name was Ray Flynn. And I'd gotten Ray Flynn in to meet Mike several times. They were both Irish Catholics. They both liked sports. They were both progressive. So they liked each other. And Ray would often, the mayor would often ask me, how's your friend Mike doing? And so when Mike came down with cancer, he had been invited to speak to the anti-poverty program in Boston for their annual dinner. And I told the mayor that Mike was coming to Boston. He said, well, I want to get together with him and see him. So I arranged for that to happen. And then the mayor said to me, you know, I told him that Mike was dying of cancer. And he said, why don't we make this Michael Harrington Day in Boston? And why don't we give him a key to the city? And why don't we honor him? And so we did at that. So the mayor came to the anti-poverty dinner. And he said a few nice words about Mike, and he proclaimed it Michael Harrington Day, and the Boston Globe wrote an editorial, because a friend of mine was their lead editorial writer, saying nice things about Mike's legacy. And the mayor gave him the key to the city. I know Mike really appreciated it. And later that night, Mike and I and a few other people went out with the mayor to drink. He liked to drink. I don't like to drink, but whenever I was with Mike, I drank more than I should. And Mike, you know, he knew he was dying. And so somebody asked Mike at the time, you know, so what's the most important thing you ever did? And I thought he was going to talk about working with Martin Luther King, or I thought he was going to talk about writing The Other America, or I thought he was going to talk about building the socialist movement or something. He said, the most important thing I ever did was raise my children. And so I think that, you know, and I think he also felt he neglected his children a little bit because he was on the road so much. But I think that's a good thing to remember, right? Because, you know, why are we socialists? Why are we radicals? Why do we want to change the world? It's not about academic ideas. It's not about the debate about good and evil, right? It's about what kind of world do we want our children to inherit? What kind of world do we want our grandchildren to inherit? And so that's why I come back to the question that I asked at the beginning, which was all the ideas that we take for granted now were once considered radical. So I have 15-year-old twin daughters, and I wonder what kind of world we're handing to them. But I dedicated the book to my daughters because there is a new generation of people who are fighting but fighting the next wave of battles. And the last chapter of the book is called The 21st Century So Far. And I summarize in that last chapter some of the things that have happened in the last 12 years that are quite remarkable, that the press doesn't give much attention to. There have been some incredible movements for the immigrant rights movement, the takeover of the factory in Chicago, Republic Windows and Doors, the victory of the gay rights movement in New York State and many other states to make gay marriage legal, the battle for domestic workers and the civil rights movement for domestic workers, the battles against sweatshops that have been important on American campuses. There's a group in Florida called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is sort of the next wave of the farm workers movement after 25 years after the death of Cesar Chavez. There is a remarkable group of young people in their 20s and 30s and 40s. To me, young, being 40, you can still be young, and who are the next generation. And so my book ends on a note of hope and is upbeat. I believe that just like I said in the beginning, there are radical ideas and there are people fighting for those radical ideas today that are making progress, and that I hope that we will be able to look back on the year 2012, 50 years from now or 100 years from now, and recognize that although we are sometimes worried about the future of our country for good reason, and for all the reasons that you pointed out about, where's the left when we need it, right? And why hasn't the Obama administration lived up to the hopes we all had for it, that every generation seems to find a way to reproduce another wave of radical uprising, another Occupy movement that can't seem to come out of nowhere, and challenges the status quo and forces people to rethink the way we do things. And the Occupy movement has had enormous impact, even though the occupiers themselves have been evicted from the places that they occupied. I did a very quick study, very simple study, about a month after Occupy began last September. And I looked at the number of times the word inequality appeared in the major newspapers in America. And for the previous year before October or September of 2011, if you looked on a chart, the number of times in the major newspapers the word inequality was very steady, like this. And then the Occupy movement happens in September, and by a month later, the number of times that the newspapers and the major media were talking about inequality had tripled. Right? The number of times they talked about greed, the richest 1%, that Americans the conversation in America has changed in the last year. Now, whether or not that gets reflected in the November elections depends on lots of things, some of which we don't have control over and some of which we do. But I do believe that the Occupy movement is one of those turning points in America that we can take advantage of, and that the labor movement and the community organizing movement and other grassroots movements have a new political climate. And the best example, one of the good examples of that is, does anybody know about the Homeowners Bill of Rights that passed 2 weeks ago, a week ago, right? So for 2 years, ACE, the Alliance for Californians for Community Empowerment, used to be ACORN, and some unions and other community organizing groups have been trying to get a bill through the state legislature to protect homeowners against abusive foreclosures by banks. Because California is the nation's capital of foreclosures. And the real estate industry and the banking industry and the Chamber of Commerce were able to kill it for 2 years. And a week and a half ago, it passed both houses of the State Assembly and the Senate. And last Wednesday, Governor Brown came down to LA to sign the bill, right? Why did that happen? How did that happen? It was an incredible community organizing and legislative lobbying effort, which I'm going to write something about, hopefully in the LA Times. You'll be able to read about it in the next couple weeks, I hope, if they accept my op-ed. If not, I'll publish it somewhere else. And the political climate had changed. And it's harder for banks to argue to legislators now that you should not protect people who are being abusively foreclosed. And so I'm upbeat and hopeful that the political moment we're living in now is the beginning of a new wave of activism. And it won't be called socialism, but the ideas of the socialist movement, the ideas of Eugene Debs, the ideas of Norman Thomas, the ideas of Michael Harrington, the ideas of this tradition of radicalism in America are part of the thread of this new wave of radicalism and activism. And I'm grateful for DSA, even though it's a small organization, right, for keeping the flame alive and reminding us of this history. And I tried to do the same thing in the book, and I hope you'll buy it. It's for sale over there, and if you would like to buy it, I'd be happy to sign it. So thank you very much.